Welcome back to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor. Today I talk with developmental and line editor Ellen Tilton-Cantrell, PhD. After serving as a visiting assistant professor at a local college for a year, Ellen decided that she wanted a more flexible career that would allow her to be at home with and available for her children. A mentor recommended that she try editing, so she enrolled in an editing certificate program and some other courses and got to work. But the meat of this episode centers on Ellen's process for developmental editing. We cover how clients find her and hire her, 2 services she offers, a manuscript assessment and a structural edit, and what's included in each, how she prices each service, and the several project tiers she offers clients to accommodate their diverse needs and budgets, the deliverables she provides clients that keep them coming back and referring her to their colleagues. Ellen also shares information about the book development workshop she ran this summer and her plans for a repeat in 2025. This 8-week course and group coaching program helps academic authors to finish their book manuscripts during their summer downtime by helping them stay focused and accountable. If you're considering taking the leap into freelance academic editing, get my free video series on academic editing and coaching, and find out more about my course and group coaching program at acadiaediting.com/become-an-editor. Now, here's my interview with Ellen. Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor, the podcast. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. In 2019, I was a political science professor who was fed up with the stress and hostility of academia, not to mention the low pay. I left my tenure-track job and went from barely surviving to thriving as a freelance academic editor. Today, I own Acadia Editing Services, an editing and coaching business that brings in 6 figures a year. In this podcast, I'll discuss the challenges of academia, what academic editing involves, and what life as a freelancer looks like. If you're willing to jump outside your comfort zone, it is possible to find joy, true flexibility, and a profitable and rewarding career as an academic editor. Thanks for listening. Today on the podcast, I have with me Ellen Tilton. And Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So why don't you start off by giving us a little bit of your background and, how you left academia and became an editor?
Sure. So at the point that I left academia, I had done just one visiting assistant professor gig, and that was a sort of local to me gig. We had moved to Minneapolis while I was writing my dissertation because my husband got a job there. And I had a baby during my last year writing my dissertation. So during the local to me visiting assistant professor gig, I had a baby. And I think that gig kind of sealed for me that I wanted to be able to have a job where I could take weekends and evenings off. I felt, even though I wasn't really doing research that year, it still felt incredibly intense. And the other thing is that my husband had a stable job that he really liked, and it felt like the bar for having him quit that job was pretty high. So I think I applied for maybe 2 jobs or something very half-heartedly, but basically decided that I was going to leave academia. So that was 10 and a half years ago. And my first couple years after leaving academia, I did various things. I had a stint teaching creative writing to high school students, and then I was doing freelance translation. And my PhD is in Japanese literature, so I was doing Japanese to English translation. And then one of my mentors from grad school suggested that I try my hand at editing because he thought he'd be good at it, or because he thought I'd be good at it. And I didn't even really know that freelance editing was a thing. But one of the reasons that I went to grad school in literature is because I really love close reading and pulling texts apart and thinking about how they're put together. Uh, and so in some ways, it felt really exciting and kind of like a natural fit. So he sent my first clients were people who this mentor sent to me. And the first projects I did were line editing. Um, and I liked it. And so I thought, okay, I want to get some proper training. And so uh, I did an editing certificate program through UC Berkeley Extension. Um, and then I had kind of a hiatus. My younger child was born, and I took most of a year off uh, while my younger daughter was a baby and my older daughter was in her last year before kindergarten. And during that year, I kind of read everything I could get my hands on having to do with academic writing. And I did do a little bit more toward my editing certificate program. And then at the end of that year, the mentor who'd originally suggested I might try my hand at editing had me line edit his book. And so that was my first full book project. And then I did kind of some other small projects, got a website together. And then uh, there was a kind of established academic editor who did developmental editing who found me through Twitter, which is kind of funny because I have a very minimal social media presence, and who asked if I might wanted to subcontract for her. And so then I ended up my first real developmental editing projects were with her, and she was a mentor to me. She kind of showed me the ropes of creating a manuscript assessment, things like that. And then after that, I also I did maybe a year later, I did Laura Portwood Stacer's developmental editing course, and she also has a course on book proposals that I did. In there, I also did a 4-month coach training program. And so I was sort of in the mode of like training. And then the pandemic hit and my business kind of revved up even more. It seems like a lot of people were home, with more time to write, and sometimes travel budgets that they decided they were going to use for editing. So that kind of put an end to my training blitz. But yeah, at this point, I do developmental editing and I also line edit, which I actually kind of think of as part of the developmental editing process. And I'd be happy to talk more about the different components of developmental editing.
Yeah, I'm curious about, since you mentioned the certificate program, I'm curious about what your biggest takeaways were from that. And because there's always this question of, if people have a PhD or, scholarly training, do they need to do an editing certificate or not? And so I wonder if you feel like, looking back, did that really help you get started, or was it just practice, or what are your reflections on that experience?
Sure. As far as the certificate program goes, in retrospect, it wasn't that useful for developmental editing. There were 4 courses. The first was grammar boot camp. The second and third were on copy editing. And then the fourth was kind of more on substantive editing. It dipped a little into developmental components, but there wasn't a whole lot there. None of it was really about academic editing. That said, I always thought of myself as having a very good command of grammar, and I definitely learned things still from the courses I did through the editing certificate program. So I don't regret it. I think it probably made me feel more confident in certain aspects, maybe not so much of the developmental editing, but certain things that I do as I line edit.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I'd necessarily, if I were going to recommend something to somebody who wanted to do developmental editing, I think at this point, when I did Laura Portwood Stacer's class, it had live components and feedback. And I think at this point, it's just the things that she has pre-recorded. So it may not be quite as useful, but yeah, that might be the thing that I would recommend.
Yeah, that's the sense that I get from most people, I think, is it's sort of a certificate program is sort of a nice to have, but not a necessary thing to do. And like you said, it can help you get your feet wet and build confidence. But, if you're eager to just jump right into the work, then you don't have to do it. But yeah, maybe these smaller courses like Laura's and, others might be more useful, more targeted to people, depending on what their specific interests are. So.
Sure. I do think that if I were primarily copy editing, I don't know, I might say sure, it was more relevant. But even then, I don't know that I'd say it's necessary.
Yeah. Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you. So it sounds like most of your work is developmental editing. So would you say that most of your clients are faculty and that you're working on their books?
Yes. I pretty much work just with faculty. I mean, there are some people who are doing postdocs or things like that, but I don't work with students. And occasionally I work with journal articles. Occasionally I do things like line edit, tenure documents. This tends to be for my clients I've already worked with on their books. But the vast majority of what I do is developmental editing for books.
And I wanted to, I was looking through your website before we started talking, and I wanted to compliment you on it because it's beautiful and it's well put together. And, I want to tell, I'll put the link in the notes for the episode, but you have this great header where you briefly explain, what it is that you do for clients or how you help clients. You have schedule a consultation right up front. You have these great testimonials. I think it's a great model for new editors to take a look at. And then I also saw that you have a newsletter sign up for people who want to stay in touch with you. So I'm curious, how do you think most clients are finding you? Are you doing any kind of marketing, or is it referrals, or, how are people finding you and becoming part of your world?
Sure. Well, first I'll say, thank you. I'm glad you like my website. The newsletter sign up, I added to the website over the summer, and my intention was to begin a newsletter this fall, and then I didn't. I think I had, I don't know, a lot of clients or a lot of projects this fall with some scope creep, and I ended up not having the bandwidth for that. So, but I'm hoping to actually launch that sometime soon. My clients find me through referrals pretty much. Mostly referrals from past clients. And sometimes I haven't done this in a little while, but sometimes I do explicitly at the end of a project, ask a client, either if they'd be, if they might mention my name to colleagues who have mentioned that they might need editing help, if they're happy with what I've done. Usually I would say this if they seem happy with what I've done, or I ask for testimonials. And I don't know, I tend to be I kind of, I don't like asking people for things. And so it always feels a little bit awkward, but my clients have generally been extremely kind of warm and gracious. And so that's been really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great practice to get into, just getting in the habit of asking, assuming, like you said, if that they are happy with your work, saying, would you mind sharing my name with anybody, or sharing my website or something like that, and asking for the testimonial, because then we sort of make it a habit. And it does feel weird. It feels like I've done this work for you, but now I'm asking something from you. But I think that's actually the best time to ask, when they get the project back and they're just so elated with the work you've put into it. And I think at that point, they're most willing to give back to you. Yeah. And it's top of mind. So, if you send it back and they say, oh, great, thanks, this is wonderful, you can say, hey, would you mind sharing my name? Or, would you write up a testimonial or whatever? And so, right, yeah, I think it's a great practice for everybody to get into. And as far as the newsletter, I totally understand, because when I first started, it was so it's almost torturous to come up with ideas of things to write about, and ever since I started this podcast, it's been like my easy way out of writing newsletters, because now my weekly newsletter is just sharing the podcast episode and, a couple tidbits or pieces of news or something like that. But yeah, it's tough to do, but great that you at least have something there to try to start collecting emails.
Yeah, and I think one idea I had with the newsletter is that I wanted it to focus partly on things having to do with the process of writing. So in my work as an editor, I don't do mindset coaching. But I think I mentioned before that I had done some coach training, and I guess basically I've been interested in helping people with sort of things having to do with project management and fears and, kind of like the various emotional obstacles to writing. And so that is something that I ended up weaving into my book development workshop, which I can talk about later. And I kind of, with the newsletter, I sort of had the idea that, I'd like it to focus both on the craft of writing, but also on the process of writing.
Yeah, I think that can be really helpful. So speaking of developmental editing, let's take a deep dive today into what exactly developmental editing is, because I think, like you said, you had no idea that freelance editors existed. I didn't either when I started until I wrote my book. And so I think we have a chance for you to help demystify what exactly this is and how the process works for both authors and editors. So why don't you start? I know there are typically two aspects of developmental editing, and there's the manuscript assessment and there's the structural edit. So why don't you walk us through what each of those things is and, how they're different or how an author might decide which one they want?
Yeah. So one thing I will just say up front is, even though in general, developmental editors tend to work with complete or mostly complete manuscripts, and then book coaches tend to work more with people as they are developing the manuscript in the first place, with the kind of work in progress. I do have colleagues who work with people chapter by chapter and who think of themselves as developmental editors. And there are ways of doing that. Like, the thing that gets trickier is you can't really see the full thing and how it fits together if you're working chapter by chapter. But for example, my colleague, Alison Van Deventer, does something where she does a book audit with people where she talks through, she has this system that's based on a book she co-wrote with Caitlin Knox called the Dissertation to Book Workbook, where she thinks about book questions and chapter answers. And so she'll kind of like have an initial 2 or 3 hour call, I think, where she talks with people about sort of how their different chapters kind of would fit into this scheme. And then kind of with that groundwork in place, she then will work with people chapter by chapter and give feedback on a chapter by chapter basis. I usually do work with mostly complete or complete manuscripts. And in part, I think it's actually a little bit difficult to do both, because I tend to work with full manuscripts. I'm booking pretty big swaths of time for each client in my schedule. And so I tend to book pretty far out. And then that makes it harder to fit in the kind of shorter, like, oh, here's a chapter, that kind of work. But also, I think I prefer working with the full or almost full manuscript because I do feel like it lets me really get my head into the book better. And kind of, just because even if you talk with a client about their project, they don't always necessarily know like what things to communicate about what they're doing that would be useful for you in helping them kind of figure out how things might fit together. So I usually do start with a manuscript assessment. People also sometimes call this a revision letter or a phase one edit or an editorial letter. There's different lingo, or a manuscript evaluation. Or sometimes people call this just a developmental edit, especially if it's combined with some in-text comments. But basically, the core of this phase is I read a manuscript closely. I usually do it with a hard copy. I'm not sure that's typical, but I feel like I can read better that way. And I read with an eye to trying to figure out what the chapter arguments are, what the central argument is, and often those things don't necessarily mesh with the stated chapter arguments or the stated central argument. Often kind of like what the author has kind of laid out as their argument doesn't really reflect what they're doing. And so then, kind of trying to figure out, okay, what does reflect what they're doing, or what could, with some tweaks, work, like be an effective argument for the book as a whole, and really work with what different chapters are doing. And a big thing is trying to kind of make sure that each chapter is doing something distinct, but that still contributes to the book as a whole. So I'd say the most important foundational thing is figuring out kind of what chapter arguments could best serve the book, or at least, of course the author has final say, but, thinking of some ideas for what could work well. And then there's also a lot of thinking about things like organization and structure. Does the sequencing of the chapters make sense? How is the internal organization of chapters? In a manuscript assessment, I wouldn't necessarily do an in-depth, okay, here's how you should reorganize your chapter. But if there are kind of broad suggestions for, thinking about organizing subsections around kind of central points that contribute to the chapter argument, or things like that, that sort of feedback would be a part of this. Recurring stylistic issues. So in the manuscript assessment, you might comment on pacing, or on ways to make the ideas or language more accessible to an audience that isn't just made up of specialists, since, books, even academic books, are going to have broader audiences than journal articles. Or thinking about, how can an author better center their own points when they're drawing from other scholarship, or things like that. Or, some things having to do with tone, and, if there's a lot of hedging, is there a way to kind of make the wording feel more confident? So I'd say basically, exactly what an assessment looks like varies from manuscript to manuscript, because different manuscripts have different needs. But I'd say, I usually start with kind of the most foundational elements, and then kind of work my way to more subtle issues. And I also have, I can say a little more about this. I have I have multiple different versions of my manuscript assessment that people can choose from, and at different price points. And so kind of then within each version, I'll kind of, if some of the foundational elements are in pretty good shape, then I may focus more of my time and energy on some of the more subtle issues. Another thing I didn't mention that often comes up is just kind of making sure that key concepts are clear and kind of pulled across the manuscript. I think a lot about through line, and just kind of making sure that the ideas from one chapter to another really build on each other.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great overview. I think that the value, you're demonstrating the huge value of working with a developmental editor, because when any author sits down to write a book, the project starts, here in one place, and we're writing about our arguments in one way. And then as the project evolves and the writing evolves, we may kind of change it up a little bit, right? Maybe the thesis is still the same, but the points that we're emphasizing are a little different. And we don't realize it because it can be so hard to just hold all of that information in our head. And to have a neutral party, a third party, look at the book, with a critical eye, and be able to give you that broad overview, but while also focusing on so many of these details, is just such a huge resource, I think, especially if you're doing it before you submit to the press. It's going to help you, increase your chances of getting your book accepted at those, the target press that you want to go to, than if you just submit this unreviewed manuscript on your own.
And I will say people come to me at different phases of their process. So often people do come to me before they submit to a press, but I also have people come to me after they've completed peer review, in which case, some of my focus might also be thinking about how to help them implement the changes that peer reviewers have suggested, though I also, usually have my own suggestions that have more to do with making the book effective for target readers and less to do with, like, the peer review comments tend to be more content specific.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you give clients options in terms of different packages or price points. And I'm curious, I assume it's because people just have different budgets and they have different levels of it or expectations with how much work you're going to put into that. But maybe could you explain a little bit of those differences between the packages? And what is the deliverable? Because as you said, you're not really editing the text itself. You're not making any of these changes. You're just, is it like a report in a Word document, or what does that look like for each project?
Yeah. So for my manuscript assessments, I have what I call my standard assessment and my in-depth assessment, and then my in-depth assessment with the add-on of chapter by chapter feedback. And then I'm a little on the fence about whether I want to keep doing this, but I've also had a version of all of my assessments that I call a developmental consultation. So, okay, so to start with my standard assessment, actually, and the in-depth assessment, the usual thing I do is I write a detailed editorial letter. And in terms of the different price points, in the standard version, I'm putting somewhat less time into really, like, reading the full manuscript really closely and kind of doing everything I could possibly do to kind of figure out possible solutions to all the issues I identify. It's a little like, so for the my least expensive version, I may put 6 days into creating the assessment, whereas for my most intense version, I'll put in a month. And I tend, just as an editor, for better or worse, I tend to skew toward the super thorough, super in-depth. And so, I'm not sure how many people have versions that they'd put a month into, but so I'd say that in my least intensive version, I strategically read really closely, but then there may be parts of the manuscript that I read a little less closely. And I'll kind of, I always start with, trying to articulate a central argument that could work well and chapter arguments that would work well with that central argument. But I may put a little less time into really finessing that. And I'd say also the stylistic issues are the easiest to flag, and subtle issues having to do with conceptualization and argumentation are harder. And so I'd say that, if somebody is especially worried about kind of different stylistic issues, I would probably recommend this least intensive version, because those are things that I can provide concrete recommendations for fairly easily. And the things that are really harder are if there are sort of deeper things having to do with the argument and key concepts that really just aren't quite working, but where really sort of trying to figure out an alternate way of framing things that could make things work is going to require a lot of kind of intellectual effort. That's where it gets really time consuming.
Yeah, it sounds like you're offering clients the option of essentially, how much time do you want me to spend on this? How deep do you want me to go?
Basically.
And they can choose based on their budget and, the quality of their manuscript or how much work they think it needs. And
exactly. I will say, I mentioned, I'm sorry, there's also the option of the chapter by chapter feedback. So what that is, in my standard feedback, and in terms of the deliverable, I think my lengthiest editorial letters have been 24 single space pages. And my shortest might be more like 9.
That's impressive.
But the lengthiest probably do include chapter by chapter feedback. So that is something that would be less detailed than the sort of feedback I would offer and the kind of concrete hands-on help I would offer in structural editing, which I can talk about shortly. But with the chapter by chapter feedback, I wouldn't just be offering feedback on the chapter as a building block in the book and on kind of like various recurring issues and the kind of concepts that are core to the book as a whole, but I would also be offering some feedback on how to make each chapter function better as a chapter. So, kind of some top revision suggestions for each chapter.
Yeah, I think it's great that you offer that flexibility because not everybody has the same needs or the same budget. And so it's great that you give them the chance to choose. And I'm totally fine if you don't know exactly, but what would you say is the general breakdown on what people choose? Like out of your clients, how many or what percentage are choosing the more detailed options versus the less detailed?
I would say that people tend to actually choose my in-depth assessment the most, but not necessarily with the chapter by chapter feedback. And then just to say a little bit more about, I mentioned this developmental consultation option. So all of my assessments include a consultation at the end. They all include usually an hour-long call at the end so that we can kind of debrief after the writer has reflected on my feedback. But I've also offered a version that I call a developmental consultation that includes an extra Zoom call. And this version, my initial idea with it was I was putting so much time into creating really polished editorial letters. And as an editor, you feel kind of extra pressure for your own prose to be really polished. And so I think my original idea was to basically offer the same feedback, but in the form of detailed bullet points, somewhat less polished, and then which, could save me a lot of time, but then add an additional Zoom call in there, with the additional call being a couple hours in length. Where we could kind of have a collaborative back and forth about some element of the manuscript that maybe felt a little thorny. And I'm considering phasing this out basically because I've had trouble, just because of my own instincts, I've had trouble actually having this bullet point form take less time than my normal assessment. That said, I think the extra Zoom call sometimes can be really fruitful. So I'm still kind of toying with what the next iteration should be for that. And then the other thing I'll say, people sometimes ask about length the manuscript and whether that factors into pricing. So in my case, I have flat fees, but then I have a discount for manuscripts that are below a certain word count and a surcharge for manuscripts that are above a certain word count. So I have a per word surcharge for manuscripts over 100,000 words and a per word discount for manuscripts under 70,000 words. And I would say sometimes, even very short manuscripts, often manuscripts that are short because they're incomplete. And it doesn't necessarily actually save me that much time for them to be short because sometimes kind of figuring out like what the missing chapter should do, usually I at least ask for notes on kind of what they're envisioning for the chapter or things like that. Can be a little bit tricky. Also, sometimes I'll have really theoretically dense manuscripts and they might be short, but they're not any less difficult. But I do, I work with a lot of people in the humanities, and humanities manuscripts can get quite long. Like I think I've worked with manuscripts that are, trying to think what the longest is, like 160,000 words. And I would say that the surcharge that I charge doesn't, like if I have a really lengthy manuscript, it probably doesn't actually even really quite cover all of the extra time I put in, but it at least kind of makes up for some of the time that I spend reading the extra chapters at least, or the extra word count.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. That's really helpful because I always have a lot of people ask me, how do you price out for a developmental edit? And I'm like, well, I don't do a lot of them. So, if I do one, I try to guess at how long it's going to take me. And that's my best advice. So that's really helpful to hear how you have that system in place, to create clarity for yourself and for the client. So what about the more structural edits then?
Sure.
What are you doing differently in those and how are you pricing them?
Okay, so structural editing is a phase that a lot of manuscripts don't need, maybe even most. But when I recommend it, it can be one of the more complicated parts of the process. So I would usually recommend structural editing either if I'm suggesting a major reorganization. I have helped writers bring an 8-chapter structure down to a 6-chapter structure, or so like merging chapters, or cutting major elements of something and then bringing it to other points in the book. Or another thing that structural editing might involve is if there's a book that where the chapter argument maybe hasn't been so clear, and where then the sub-arguments within the chapters haven't been very clear, I might help kind of within each chapter, I might help a writer to really think about, okay, if we adopt X as the chapter argument, what would the different sections need to look like? How, at the kind of section by section level, how would we clarify the central points? And then how would we revise the material to support those points? What would we need to trim? What sorts of transitions would we need to add? How would we articulate the central point? And you can imagine that this kind of work can be quite time intensive. And if I do, and there may be somebody who needs that kind of help just for a single chapter, not necessarily for their whole book. Or somebody might want structural help for their whole book. But so in this kind of editing, I'm still not editing at the sentence by sentence level, but I would be, with the client's permission, I will move material around. I will make cuts, and I usually create a snippets file for any material that doesn't find a new home in the revised version or in the edited version. Um, and I also will, I don't necessarily. I mean, I will occasionally, draft a signposting paragraph or that kind of thing. But oftentimes I'll use angle brackets and add in comments about, like you might add a sentence or a paragraph that functions in this way, that provides this kind of transition from this to this, or introduces this idea. So I'll provide kind of very detailed guidelines on this material that the author might draft to kind of make things work in the new sequence. So I'd say that structural editing, it's both quite time consuming on my part, and it also creates quite a lot of work for the author. But that's sort of where, in terms of a line between being a developmental editor and a ghostwriter, even if I occasionally do draft, a paragraph or a sentence that the client might adopt or might use as a jumping off point, I'm mostly not actually like drafting material from scratch for them, but instead kind of providing guidance on, okay, this is what you might draft that might work effectively here. I lost my train of thought, but yeah.
No, I think that's a great distinction to make, because I've done similar. I've left similar comments where even like when I'm just line editing, oftentimes an author will end a paragraph with a quote from someone else, and I'll say, oh, I think maybe it would help to add a sentence here, wrapping up the points of the paragraph, and I'll say maybe you could start it like blah, blah, blah. And I'll start the sentence sort of to get them like a jumping off point, and then, they can finish it with whatever the actual content is. So yeah,
and
go ahead.
Oh, I'd say that a thing that is tricky with the structural editing phase of things is that there is often quite a lot of time that I spend reading and rereading and mulling over things and trying to figure out what structure will make things work, what, for example, if I'm clarifying sub arguments, like, well, what should those be, like what would work for this material and work for the broader argument. But there's often quite a lot of time that's part of the process where you feel like you're not really producing anything, because it takes so much thinking work. And with the manuscript assessment, that's also true, but I just have this flat fee and the thinking time is kind of built in. With structural editing, I don't usually operate by a flat fee, but then one thing that can be tricky for me is, sometimes I'll want to be like, oh, well, so I usually offer an estimated range, like it will cost between this and this. And I don't necessarily say what my hourly rate is, but I kind of base it on how much time I put in. And the thing that can be sort of tricky is I often sort of feel like, well, I shouldn't count that time because I didn't really, produce anything. And yet I know that it is a key part of the process.
It's time. Even if you're thinking through questions or strategies or something, it's still time that your brain is devoted to this project, as opposed to devoting to yourself or, another aspect of your business or another project. So yeah. Do you use a time tracker or something?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I use a tracker called Timular.
Okay. I've used Clockify, which has been really helpful to track the projects and everything. So that's interesting to know that you don't necessarily give them your hourly rate, but you sort of know, and you know what it is, or you know what you want it to be, and then you estimate, this range for the client, so they at least have an idea. You're not leaving it totally open-ended for them, that they don't know what they're going to be paying you. They at least have an idea of about what you think it will be.
Mm-hmm. I used to, just do things by the hour and provide my hourly rate. And I sometimes still do. For example, if if there's a client I've been working with for a while, like last year, there was a client I'd been helping him with his book for over the course of a couple of years. And he was making some final revisions and wanted me to do some final line editing. And I never knew in advance what he was going to send me, and I just kind of be fitting it in here and there. And so that was definitely just by the hour. But I think the thing that's tricky with the hourly rate is that I think a lot of clients don't really have a good sense of how the hourly rate corresponds to total income or just kind of what a freelancer's work life is like. So somebody might look at an hourly rate and mentally multiply it by 40, even though that's just not, that's not how it works. So much of the time that you spend as a freelancer isn't billed, or and there's only kind of so much of the really high focus work you can do in a day. And so I've kind of started saying instead, I think this will take me this many weeks. And, this is the kind of estimated range.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think so with copy editing, I charge a per word rate for exactly that reason, because I don't want people to do that mental math and go, oh, she's making $100 an hour. So, you know what I mean? Like something that they think is outrageous. But yet we deserve to earn a high wage for this, because we're specialists and we're experts, and, we're doing really difficult work. So
I think the other thing is, just the realities of, a job that it's not attached to a salary, and there's no benefits, and just all the things that, clients don't necessarily need to kind of be educated on all that nitty gritty, but it is just different from probably what most people are used to thinking about.
Yeah, and all the emails and the invoicing and the setting up the contract or whatever. Yeah, all that stuff that may or may not go into the billable hours. Yeah. So, what you mentioned your book development workshops. What are those?
Yeah. Oh, can I just, before we move on to that, can I say a little bit about line editing, just because I do
please
think of that as part of the developmental process, at least somewhat. So one thing I just want to say is, I do know there are some editors who do a phase 1 edit, which is something like a manuscript assessment, and then a phase 2 edit, which is follow-up edits, and which may kind of fold structural editing and line editing together. And I would say I only do this if the structural work is very minor. So, often people will come back to me for line editing. And if, for example, in the course of line editing, I kind of think like, this paragraph here would work better in another section, or this section would work better in another, somewhere else, or that kind of thing. Like those are things that I can suggest pretty easily. I could even ask permission to see if they want me to actually move it for them. But basically, if the nature of the structural work is minor enough that I can easily do it in the course of line editing, then I will do those things together. But usually when I explicitly say, I think before line editing, it might be more useful to do a structural editing pass first. Usually that's if I think that a chapter or full manuscript really needs pretty intensive work on organization and on clarifying kind of section by section points. And with line editing, so, people sometimes are confused about the difference between copy editing and line editing. And I'd say, as a line editor with some copy editor training, there certainly is a lot of overlap. Like there are a lot of things a copy editor would do that I also do in the course of line editing. Though I think as a line editor, you have freer reign I remember in my copy editing training sort of getting the message that unless it's a heavy copy edit, you're on a pretty tight leash. Like you don't change things unless like there's a really compelling reason to. And as a line editor, the goal is both to achieve flow that feels good and also to clarify. And so I feel like I have a somewhat freer reign with recasting, and I query very heavily. Like the place where I think of line editing as developmental is I'm really thinking about, okay, is the logical flow of arguments going to like, does it work? Will the sequence make sense to readers? Are there any gaps in logic? And so it's sort of, in some ways, the sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph version of developmental editing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of these, as we're editing, if I see something that's wrong or that really doesn't feel accurate to me, or if there's like something missing, I can't not point that out. I may not fix it if that's not within the scope of the project, but I'll definitely leave a comment, like you said, saying, hey, I noticed this, and whatever my suggestion is, or for them to at least consider it. And yeah, I don't even really make the distinction between copy or line editing, especially if you're working with somebody that, English is not their first language or something like that. It's just you want to make revisions to the manuscript and return it as completely as possible, as so that it's as close to ready to go as it can be.
Sure. I would say that in terms of this distinction I would make between line editing and copy editing, I don't, even if there are some things that are really easy to fix that I'll go ahead and change to make something conform to Chicago style, I won't be editing specifically with an eye to making it conform to a particular style. And so, it may be that there are so many things that I'm used to flagging. It's easy to make the change in the course of things, but I almost never crack open my Chicago manual style to kind of check something, because that's not really my role. And also the people I work with usually then do have their book copy edited by the press. And so, it's not necessarily a good use of their budget for me to be focusing on some of the more mechanical elements having to do with a particular style.
Yeah, I definitely, I think most of my clients don't use Chicago. I do get some that are using Chicago, but usually that's, the finer details of
Sure.
those style guides don't really come into place for me. But tell us about your book development workshop.
Yeah. Okay. So this is sort of my biggest new thing. A year ago, Alison Van Deventer and Caitlin Knox's book, The Dissertation to Book Workbook, came out. And when I read it, I thought, oh, this seems really useful. I had been kind of thinking for a while that I wanted to have some way that was a little more affordable to help writers with the kind of big picture elements of their work, the things that I usually would do in a manuscript assessment. And so I wrote to Caitlin and Allison and said, your workbook's terrific. I'm thinking I might like to run a workshop using it. What do you think? And they wrote back saying that they actually were going to run their own version of such a workshop, but that they'd be delighted for me to do my own thing. And the other thing, so I had also mentioned earlier that I've been interested in kind of mindset and project management and emotional obstacles and things like that having to do with the writing process as well. And over the years, I have read so much of the kind of, productivity literature or whatever. And so my idea for a workshop was a workshop that would kind of have both of these things, help people think through the big picture elements of their book, and also have kind of discussions and lessons about different topics having to do with the writing process. And so I ran my workshop for the first time last May through July. It was an 8-week workshop with these two components. And I created videos for each of the writing process topics, 20 to 30-minute videos for each week, and kind of a workbook to go along with the videos. And then we had kind of live calls so that I could provide support with people working through the dissertation to book workbook exercises. Oh, and one thing I'll say about that workbook, apparently the dissertation to book workbook was like that title was a marketing decision. The book and work for a book project that did not originate as a dissertation as well. Basically, just as long as somebody has at least half of the manuscript written, maybe preferably more, so that they can really think about how their individual chapters relate to their argument in various ways. But so I had sort of live sessions. I offered written feedback to people on a course discussion forum, and I did group coaching around the writing process topics. My goal there was to create sort of a safe feeling space for people to talk about some of these challenges that sometimes can feel a little bit taboo to talk about. And that as an editor, it's not usually my focus. And so, yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I'm going to be running it this summer as well. My hope is to offer it once a year, every year. It seems like the kind of May through July timeframe works well for academics, not for everybody. And then I'm actually also next fall planning on running a version of the workshop that doesn't have the book development component, that's just the writing process component. That is less intensive, with the book development component, maybe ideally people are spending 10 to 15 hours a week on the workshop, which in the summer, if their main goal is to work on their books, might make sense, but isn't going to happen during the semester. Whereas, this version that's just about writing process would be a commitment of more like 1 to 2 hours a week, which would be much more manageable.
That's so great. Were you on the Zoom calls last summer? Were those like once a week, and those were separate from the group coaching calls?
Yeah. So last summer I had an intro call each week, and then a Q&A call each week. And then I had a session that wrote, like, every other week we had coaching calls, and every other week we had co-writing. I'm going to mix things up a little bit this next year. I found that in the Q&A calls, people often ask questions about the publishing process, which over the years I've learned a lot about, and I really enjoyed that. I'm actually going to explicitly work some of those topics into the intro call. So I'll have an intro call where we talk about the dissertation book workbook exercises for the week, and kind of things that people struggled with from the previous week, or their wins from the previous week, and also kind of provide a brief overview of the writing process topics. And then also I'm planning to build into that call a kind of 20-minute mini lesson on different topics having to do either with publishing or the revision process. And then I'm going to have the Q&A call then be every other week and alternate. Yeah, no, I think I was going to have that be every other week and alternate that with the group coaching, and then have co-writing every week.
That's great. So there's so many accountability steps built in, right? It's so easy to get lost when you're working alone on your book, but it sounds like in this program, you get this community support, you get the expert support from you get the accountability to check in each week in some way or another, and to get it done. So that sounds like you've developed a really awesome offering there.
It was really fun. I think the best part for me was just, kind of seeing the group dynamics develop and this community develop. That seemed very supportive.
Yeah. Well, so I always end each episode by asking my guest what are a couple of pieces of advice you have for anyone who is thinking about becoming an editor. What would you recommend to somebody who's thinking about it or who is just starting out?
Yeah. Um, I think I'd probably recommend that people, start by dipping their toes in, doing some editing. And, maybe if you're thinking about doing it, you've already done some of that and you know that you like it. Um, and maybe also, I probably would recommend an informational interview with, if there's a particular kind of editing that you think you'd be interested in. You might see if you can find an editor who works in that area or works in that way, so that you can learn more about, what the things are that they like, that they find challenging. If they're kind of what resources they would recommend. And maybe um, if they have sort of some things they can say about their own path that might be useful to you. So yeah, I'd recommend talking to editors. Um, and then I guess, as far as if somebody is currently in academia and thinking of leaving, I feel like those situations can vary so much. And, one thing, like my own situation is that um, at the point that I left academia, I my spouse had a job, and so that provided a certain amount of cushion, even if there are also constraints attached to that. And if that's not your situation, then I suppose probably making sure that you're in a situation financially where you can, just because I feel like freelancing can be a sort of slow ramp up, and it can take a little time to get to the point where you're kind of really making an income that you can support yourself on by doing it. And so I guess just kind of thinking about your situation, and if if there's some way that you can, I mean, I think I've heard of some people who start doing a little bit more before they leave, or kind of try to get the ball rolling a little bit to position themselves well before they take the leap. But yeah, I guess basically, yeah, I'd say that dipping your toe in piece is about sort of saying like, yeah, well, how do I like this? How do I like doing it? Um, and then as far as talking to people, I suppose part of that is just there may be pieces of editing that you haven't necessarily, like, for example, doing developmental editing for a book is something that you might not really um, have the opportunity to try doing. But if you can talk to somebody who does it and sort of get a sense for like, yeah, does this seem like it sort of fits with my interests and the things that I like puzzling over and my workflow and my skill set and whatever, I think that might be useful. And then, right. And then the practical components, it just feels probably smart to map that out.
Yeah, I want to echo the value of the informational interview. And I think especially those of us who have left academia, most of us are willing to talk to anybody who's considering leaving, because we know how hard that decision can be. So definitely, if anybody is listening who is thinking about it, don't hesitate to reach out to someone and ask to chat with them for a little while. And I think they're going to be pretty receptive of it. Well, thank you so much. I think this conversation has been super helpful to anyone who's thinking about going into developmental editing, or, trying to figure out the process and the pricing and all of that. So if anybody would like to work with you, how can they best get in touch?
Sure. I would recommend coming to my website. You can either fill out my intake form, or you can just send me an email. So my website is tiliaeditorial.com. My email is ellen@tiliaeditorial.com.
Awesome. And I'll put those links in the show notes for people to get in touch with you. Well, thanks again, Ellen. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
If you're unhappy in academia and you think you might be a good editor or writing coach, check out my course, Becoming an Academic Editor. This digital course is paired with a 12-week group coaching program to support you through your decision to leave academia or not, and to start building a profitable and rewarding academic editing business. Learn more by going to acadiaediting.com/become an editor. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.